The night Cedric Ashcombe walked into the Valecourt masquerade, 300 guests held champagne they suddenly forgot how to drink. He came without invitation, without warning. The Black Duke of the North, whose iron foundries had swallowed entire counties, and whose name alone collapsed stock prices on the London Exchange. Nobody wanted him there. Every man in that gilded ballroom owed him something, feared him for something, or had whispered his name in conspiracies they prayed he never discovered. And then the Valecourt family dragged their own daughter onto the stage and tore her apart in front of all of them. What happened next destroyed the old order of English aristocracy forever. If you think you know how this ends, you do not. Stay until the final moment, and tell me where you are watching from tonight. The Valecourt estate had been dying for years, and the masquerade was its funeral dressed in silk. October fog crawled across the grounds like something wounded, wrapping around the limestone columns and smearing the gaslight into jaundiced halos that made the arriving carriages look like coffins rolling through smoke. Inside, the ballroom stank of expensive perfume layered over something no amount of money could disguise. Rot. Financial rot. Social rot. The kind that ate foundations while the chandeliers still blazed overhead, convincing everyone the ceiling would hold for one more night. Cedric Ashcombe noticed the smell the moment he crossed the threshold. He always noticed decay first. It was a talent inherited not from breeding, but from 15 years of building an empire out of coal dust, railway steel, and the broken contracts of men who underestimated him. His father had been a minor landowner in Yorkshire with delusions of aristocratic grandeur and a drinking habit that consumed what little fortune the family possessed. By the time Cedric was 19, he had buried his father, sold the estate for raw capital, and purchased his first failing foundry in Sheffield. By 25, he controlled 3 railways. By 30, Parliament whispered his name, the way sailors whispered about storms they could see forming on the horizon, but could not outrun. Now he was 36, and he stood in the Valecourt ballroom wearing black from collar to boot, scanning 300 aristocrats the way a wolf scans a flock, trying to decide which animal limps. "You were not invited, Your Grace." The voice belonged to a footman whose hands trembled around a silver tray. Cedric did not look at him. "I never am," he said, "and yet doors open." He moved through the crowd like a blade through water. Conversations died in his wake. Women pulled their dance partners closer, not from attraction, but from the instinct that proximity to power required either submission or distance, and they had not yet decided which. Men nodded at him with smiles that never reached their eyes. He returned none of them. Cedric Ashcombe did not attend social functions for pleasure. He attended them for intelligence. Every ballroom was a battlefield mapped in champagne glasses and whispered alliances. Every laugh concealed a negotiation. Every dance was a transaction wearing a waltz as disguise. He had learned this not from tutors or finishing schools, but from watching his father grovel before men who despised him, begging for loans that arrived with interest rates designed to ensure permanent servitude. The lesson had branded itself into the boy who became the Duke. Never beg, never explain, never arrive anywhere without already knowing who in the room wanted you dead. Tonight, the intelligence was specific. Lord Cedric Whitmore had been quietly assembling a coalition of northern industrialists and parliamentary allies to challenge Ashcombe's railway monopoly. The details were still fragmentary. A bribed clerk in Whitmore's office had provided dates and names, but not the full architecture of the scheme. Cedric needed to see Whitmore's face when confronted with unexpected proximity. Liars always revealed themselves in the first 3 seconds of surprise. After that, they remembered their masks. But Whitmore was not the first thing that captured his attention. The Valecourt family was imploding in public, and they were doing it with theatrical commitment. Edmund Valecourt, the family patriarch, had consumed enough brandy to drown a horse and was currently holding court near the orchestra platform, his face bloated and flushed, his cravat undone, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the clarity of a man who no longer cared who heard him. Beside him stood his 2 sons, Gerald and Marcus, both cut from the same rotting cloth, both laughing with the desperate volume of men who knew their inheritance consisted of debts stacked higher than the estate walls. "Bring her out," Edmund slurred, gesturing toward the corridor with a crystal glass that sloshed amber liquid onto the marble floor. "Bring out our little saint. Let London see what the great Valecourt legacy has been reduced to." The crowd shifted. Some turned away. Most did not. Kedrick remained still near a column 20 feet from the platform, half-shadowed, watching. She emerged from the corridor like someone walking toward a firing squad who had already accepted the bullets. Lady Seraphina Valecourt, 23 years old, dark hair pinned severely against her skull, a gown that had clearly been altered from something older, the seams visible if you knew where to look, the fabric faded at the shoulders where original embroidery had been removed. She carried no fan, wore no jewelry. Her face held the specific blankness of someone who had learned very young that expressions were weapons other people used against you. Kedrick recognized that blankness. He had worn it himself for years. "There she is," Edmund announced to the room, swaying on his feet. "The daughter who thinks she is better than the family that fed her. The daughter who refused 3 marriage proposals because the men were not good enough for her refined sensibilities." He turned toward her with the deliberate cruelty of a man who enjoyed the sound of things breaking. "Tell them, Seraphina. Tell all of London why you turned down Lord Ashworth. Tell them why a family drowning in debt has the luxury of a daughter with standards." The silence that followed was the particular kind that English society perfected. Not shock, anticipation. The collective intake of breath that preceded someone else's destruction, served warm and free of charge. Seraphina looked at her father, then at the crowd, then at her father again. "Lord Ashworth," she said, and her voice did not shake, "offered £40 for my hand and unlimited access to what remained of our textile warehouses. That is not a marriage proposal, father. That is a liquidation sale." The room cracked, not with laughter, with something sharper. The sound of 300 people realizing simultaneously that the woman on display was not going to perform the role of victim they had assembled to watch. Edmund's face darkened. "You ungrateful! I am the only person in this family who has read our account ledgers in the last 2 years, Seraphina continued, her voice flat and precise as a surgeon's knife. I am also the only person in this family who has not personally contributed to the debts destroying it. So when you parade me before London society as evidence of Valecourt failure, Father, you might consider that I am the only Valecourt in this room who has not failed at anything." Gerald stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "You will shut your mouth, Seraphina." "Or what, Gerald? You will cut off my allowance. I have not received an allowance in 14 months because you spent it on racehorses that finished last." Marcus grabbed her arm. She did not flinch. She looked at his hand on her elbow the way one might look at a stain on clean linen. Annoying, removable, not worth fear. The crowd watched with the frozen fascination of people witnessing a carriage accident from the safety of a drawing room window. Nobody intervened. Nobody ever did. Kedrick had seen enough. He was not a man given to impulse. Every decision he made passed through a system of calculation so thorough that associates sometimes mistook his deliberation for hesitation. They learned quickly that it was not. What looked like patience was simply the process of ensuring that when he moved, the movement was irreversible. But watching Seraphina Valecourt stand motionless while her brother's fingers dug into her arm and 300 aristocrats observed with the engaged detachment of spectators at a dogfight, something in Kedrick's machinery rearranged itself. Not sentiment. He had no use for sentiment. Sentiment was the luxury of people who could afford to lose. What he recognized in Seraphina was structural integrity under compression. The refusal to collapse when every external force demanded it. He had built railways on that principle. He had built an empire on it, and he had never seen it manifest so completely in another human being. The calculation took 4 seconds. He stepped out of the shadow. The crowd saw him before Seraphina did. The reaction spread across the ballroom like frost across glass. Whispers first, then silence. Then the particular rigidity that English aristocrats adopted when they sensed that power had entered the room and was about to do something they could not predict or control. "Remove your hand from the lady." Marcus Valecourt looked up. His face went the color of old parchment. He released Seraphina's arm as though it had burned him. "Your Grace," Edmund stammered, suddenly aware that the most dangerous man in England was standing 6 feet from his disintegrating family spectacle. "We were not expecting me." "You were not expecting me because you did not invite me," Kedrick said. "An oversight. I have corrected myself." He looked at Seraphina. She looked back at him with an expression he could not immediately categorize, which was rare and therefore interesting. Lady Valecourt, you mentioned your family's account ledgers. What is the total outstanding debt? The room stopped breathing. Seraphina held his gaze. 47,000 pounds, approximately. The figures shift daily because interest compounds on debts my father takes to cover previous debts. Seraphina, Edmund hissed. You will not. 47,000, Cadric repeated. He turned to Edmund Valecourt the way a man turns to examine a cracked foundation before deciding whether to demolish the building or simply walk away from it. I will settle the full amount, tonight. The funds will clear through my solicitor by morning. The gasp that followed was not theatrical. It was involuntary. 47,000 pounds was not a sum. It was a statement. It was the annual revenue of a mid-sized county. Edmund blinked. Your Grace, that is extraordinarily generous. I have not finished. Cadric's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. Shouting was for men who feared they would not be heard. He had never had that fear. In exchange for the settlement of all Valecourt debts, I will take Lady Seraphina as my wife. The word wife detonated across the ballroom like grape shot. Women clutched their partners. Men exchanged glances loaded with calculations of what this meant for every alliance, every contract, every unspoken agreement that governed the invisible architecture of English power. Seraphina stared at him. For the first time that evening, her composure cracked, not into weakness, into something far more dangerous. Surprise hardening instantly into assessment. You are purchasing me, she said. I am making an investment, Cadric replied. The distinction matters. To whom? To you. In approximately 6 months, when you understand what the distinction means. Seraphina's eyes narrowed. She was reading him the way he had watched her read the room, measuring, testing, looking for the fracture that would reveal whether the structure was sound or whether the facade concealed the same rot she had spent her entire life drowning in. And if I refuse, she said, then your father's creditors will seize the estate by January, your brothers will scatter, and you will spend the next decade in the kind of genteel poverty that English society reserves for women it has already consumed and discarded. He paused. I am not offering you a rescue, Lady Valecourt. I am offering you a war fought from a position of strength instead of a cage. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Seraphina looked at her father. Edmund's eyes were wet with something that might have been shame, but was more likely relief. She looked at her brothers. Gerald had the decency to look away. Marcus did not. Then I accept, she said, but I want the ledgers transferred to my name. All of them. If I am to be sold, I will at least audit the price. Something moved behind Cadric's eyes. Not warmth, recognition. The kind that happened when two predators identified each other across a crowded field and understood that proximity would be either catastrophic or extraordinary, with nothing in between. Done, he said. They were married 11 days later in a ceremony so stripped of ceremony that London gossips struggled to describe it. No flowers, no music, no guests beyond the required witnesses, and a solicitor who spent the entire proceeding sweating through his collar. Seraphina wore gray, Cadric wore black. The vows were exchanged with the brisk efficiency of a contract signing, which is precisely what they were. Ashcombe Hall swallowed her whole. The estate sat in the Yorkshire moors like a fist of black stone thrust through the earth. No ornamental gardens, no gentle rolling lawns. The grounds were functional, organized around the industrial operations that generated Cadric's fortune. Foundry smoke drifted across the eastern fields. Railway tracks carved through the valley below like surgical scars. The house itself was enormous, cold, and deliberately unwelcoming. Every corridor was lit by gas lamps that cast shadows sharp enough to cut. Every room smelled of coal smoke and polished iron. The servants moved with the silent precision of soldiers in a garrison, and their faces held the particular emptiness of people who had learned that personality was a liability in the Duke's household. Your rooms are in the East Wing, the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, informed her on the first morning. His Grace's rooms are in the West. Meals are served at 7, 12, and 6. His Grace does not take breakfast with company. Does His Grace take anything with company? Seraphina asked. Mrs. Blackwood's expression suggested the question was either impertinent or incomprehensible, possibly both. His Grace values efficiency, Your Grace. Conversation that serves no purpose is not encouraged. Seraphina unpacked her single trunk in a bedroom that could have housed a small village. The bed was large enough to drown in. The windows overlooked the foundry district, where smokestacks pierced the gray sky like blackened fingers reaching for something they would never touch. She sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the silence. Not true silence. The silence of Ashcombe Hall was layered. Beneath the absence of voices ran the constant low thunder of the foundries, the distant metallic percussion of hammers on steel, the hiss of steam engines venting pressure through iron lungs. The house breathed with industry, the way other estates breathed with birdsong and wind through gardens. It was alive in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with production. She found the ledgers on the third day. Cadric had not hidden them. That was the first surprise. The estate office on the ground floor contained 9 years of financial records, organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Every transaction cataloged, every contract filed chronologically, every profit margin calculated to the second decimal. The system was immaculate. What it revealed was not. Ashcombe Industries controlled 4 foundries, 2 coal operations, 3 railway lines, and a network of textile mills stretching from Yorkshire to Lancashire. The profit margins were extraordinary. The methods generating those profits were something else entirely. Worker wages had been cut 3 times in 18 months. Safety expenditures had been reduced to numbers so low they functioned as mathematical fiction. Injury reports were filed under operational costs rather than humanitarian concerns. Deaths in the foundries were recorded as equipment losses. You found the numbers. Cadric stood in the doorway of the estate office, still wearing his riding coat, his dark hair damp from rain. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man watching a chess piece move to exactly the square he had anticipated. Deaths recorded as equipment losses, Seraphina said without looking up. 14 men in the last fiscal year. 14 human beings reduced to a line item between coal expenditure and transport depreciation. 17, Cadric corrected. He walked to the sideboard and poured whiskey. 3 more died after the books closed. The foundry at Harrogate had a boiler failure in September. And you say that with the same tone you would use to report weather. I say it with accuracy. Tone is decoration. He drank. Those men died because the boiler manufacturer supplied defective pressure valves. The manufacturer has since been financially destroyed. His assets were seized. His family relocated. His name erased from every industrial register in the North. Punishment does not bring 17 men back. No, but it ensures the 18th does not join them through the same cause. He set the glass down. You are reading the ledgers for moral ammunition. You want evidence that I am the monster London society has already decided I am. You are welcome to search, but you will find something more uncomfortable than villainy, Your Grace. You will find that the empire you now co-own functions because it eliminates threats that softer systems tolerate until those threats kill people. Seraphina finally looked at him. His face was angular, hard, built from planes and edges that suggested the bone structure beneath had been designed for endurance rather than beauty. His eyes were the color of smoke over steel, and they held the specific intelligence of a man who processed the world through systems rather than sentiment. He was not handsome in the way London society valued handsomeness. He was compelling in the way that loaded weapons were compelling. You could not look away because looking away meant losing track of where the danger was pointed. You married me for a reason beyond settling Valecourt debts, she said. Obviously. Tell me the reason. You stood in a room of 300 people who wanted to watch you break, and you did not break. You did not cry, you did not beg. You did not perform the expected collapse that would have allowed everyone present to feel appropriately sympathetic while doing absolutely nothing to help you. You stood there and you fought with the only weapons available to you, which were words and nerve, and you deployed both with more tactical precision than most of the men I negotiate with in Parliament. He paused. I did not need a wife. I needed an operator, someone capable of seeing the machinery instead of the wallpaper. And if I refused to operate your machinery the way you want it operated, He almost smiled. Almost. The expression died before it reached completion, strangled by whatever internal mechanism prevented Cedric Ashcombe from displaying anything that could be interpreted as vulnerability. Then we will have a very interesting marriage. She learned the machinery over the following weeks with a speed that disturbed the household staff and alarmed Cedric's senior advisors. The estate manager, a severe man named Hargrove, who had served the Ashcombe family for 20 years, discovered that the new Duchess had identified a discrepancy in the textile mill accounts within her first week. 3 foremen had been skimming raw material payments, routing the difference through a supplier in Manchester who existed only on paper. £42 a month, Seraphina told Cedric over dinner, which he had insisted they share despite Mrs. Blackwood's protests about household tradition, for at least 14 months. That is nearly £600 stolen through a system so simple it insults you that nobody caught it. Hargrove should have caught it. Hargrove is loyal, but limited. He audits for the numbers he expects. I audit for the numbers that are missing. Cedric set down his fork. He studied her across the length of a dining table that could seat 30 and currently seated 2, positioned at opposite ends like rival generals negotiating terms across a no-man's land of polished mahogany. What do you recommend? Terminate the foreman, seize the Manchester Shell Company, and restructure the mill accounting so that raw material purchases require dual authorization, 1 signature from the foreman, 1 from an independent auditor who reports directly to the estate. To Hargrove. To me. The dining room went quiet. Outside, rain hammered the windows. The foundry smoke drifted past the glass like ghosts of the men who had fed the furnaces that afternoon. You have been Duchess for 12 days, Cedric said. And in 12 days I have identified theft that your 20-year estate manager missed for 14 months. So either you give me the authority to fix what is broken, or you watch me sit in the East Wing embroidering pillows while your empire bleeds money through holes your loyalty has made you blind to. He did not answer immediately. He picked up his glass, drank, set it down. The gesture was deliberate, controlled. Everything about Cedric Ashcombe was controlled, and Seraphina was beginning to understand that the control was not merely temperamental, but structural. It was the architecture of a man who had learned very young that losing control meant losing everything. The foreman will be removed tomorrow, he said. The Manchester accounts will be seized by Thursday. The dual authorization system will be implemented across all mill operations by the end of the month. And my authority. Your authority, he said, and something in his voice shifted, some tectonic plate beneath the surface grinding against another, is whatever you can hold. She held it. Within 6 weeks, Seraphina had restructured the supply chain for the northern textile mills, identified and removed 4 additional corrupt employees, renegotiated a coal transport contract that saved the estate £1,100 annually, and earned the terrified respect of every worker, foreman, and manager in the Ashcombe network. She operated from the estate office 16 hours a day, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence and railway timetables, and she discovered something about herself that the Valecourt ballroom had only hinted at. She was not merely competent, she was exceptional. And the environment that revealed that exceptionality was not a drawing room, but a war room. But the war was not only industrial. Reports reached Ashcombe Hall through channels Seraphina was only beginning to understand. Cedric maintained a network of informants across London, Parliament, and the northern industrial districts. Paid observers in banking houses. Clerks in rival offices who sold information for sums that were trivial compared to their value. A web of intelligence that allowed the Duke to anticipate threats before they materialized. The threat that materialized in November was Lord Cedric Whitmore. He is assembling a coalition, Cedric said one evening in the estate office, standing before the fireplace with a glass of whiskey and a face carved from something harder than the stone walls around them. 6 northern industrialists, 2 members of Parliament, and 3 banking houses that hold notes on my railway operations. To what end? Seraphina asked from behind the desk where she had been reviewing the quarterly foundry reports. To destroy me. Specifically, to challenge my railway charter through parliamentary committee and simultaneously call in the banking notes, creating a liquidity crisis that forces asset sales at discount prices. Whitmore acquires the railways. Parliament gets its scapegoat. And the old aristocracy celebrates the fall of the man who had the audacity to build power instead of inheriting it. How do you know this? Because I have a clerk in Whitmore's office who copies correspondence for £12 a month. And because Whitmore is exactly the kind of man who believes that bloodline entitles him to victory. He has never lost anything he did not choose to discard. He does not understand what it means to build from wreckage, and that ignorance will be his destruction. Seraphina studied him. The firelight carved his face into something that belonged in a different century. A warlord's face, a conqueror's geometry. And behind it, in the shadows, his expression never quite managed to conceal something else. Something that looked like the residue of a boy who had watched his father beg and decided that he would sooner burn the world to cinders than kneel before anyone. "What are you planning?" she said. "The Winter Assembly at Wexmore Palace, January. Every significant political and industrial figure in England will be present. Whitmore will make his move there. He believes it will be a coordinated strike, Parliament and finance attacking simultaneously, leaving me no ground to retreat to. And you will let him make the first move." "I will let him believe he is making the first move. There is a difference." Their eyes met across the room. The fire crackled. Outside, winter had begun to close its grip on the moors, and the first snow dusted the foundry rooftops like ash from a fire that had not yet started burning. What Seraphina did not tell Kaedric that night was what she had discovered buried in the correspondence she intercepted from London that afternoon. A letter bearing the Valecourt family seal. Addressed not to her, but to Lord Whitmore. Written in her brother Gerald's handwriting. The letter offered intelligence about Ashcomb's internal operations. Routes, schedules, financial vulnerabilities, information that could only have come from inside the estate. Her own family was feeding the enemy. And somewhere in the frozen corridors of Ashcombe Hall, someone she saw every day, someone who served her meals or polished her floors or stood behind her in silence while she worked, was passing those secrets through the walls. The traitor was inside the house. Seraphina did not sleep that night. She sat in the estate office with Gerald's letter flattened on the desk before her, reading the same lines over and over until the words stopped being language and became evidence. Her brother's handwriting had always been careless, the loops too wide, the consonants crushed together like he resented the effort of forming them. But the content was precise. Shipping schedules for the Ashcombe coal transports, tonnage figures for the Sheffield foundry, the exact dates when railway maintenance would leave the Northern Line vulnerable to disruption. Details that Gerald Valecourt did not possess the intelligence to compile on his own. Someone inside Ashcombe Hall was feeding him. The candle on the desk guttered in a draft she could not locate. Somewhere beneath the floor, the foundry night shift hammered steel into shapes that would become railway joints by morning. The rhythm was steady, mechanical. It sounded like a heartbeat belonging to something too large to be alive but too persistent to be dead. She folded the letter and placed it inside the ledger she had been auditing. Then she closed the ledger and sat in the dark, listening. Trust was a currency she had stopped spending years ago. The Valecourt household had taught her that lesson before she was old enough to understand the vocabulary. People did not betray you because they were evil. They betrayed you because loyalty cost more than they were willing to pay, and the moment a cheaper option presented itself, they took it with the relieved efficiency of someone switching to a less expensive butcher. Gerald had not joined Whitmore's conspiracy out of malice. He had joined it because malice required conviction, and Gerald had never been convicted of anything except laziness. He had joined because someone offered him a way back to relevance, and relevance was the only drug the Valecourt men had ever understood. The question that kept her motionless in that dark office was not who inside the house was passing information that she could find. That was detective work, methodical and finite. The question was whether to tell Kaedric. She understood what he would do. She had watched him dismantle the foreman who stole from the textile mills. No rage, no dramatic confrontation, just the systematic removal of every financial, social, and professional foundation beneath their feet until they stood on nothing and realized too late that the ground had been taken while they were still looking at the sky. He would do the same to Gerald, to Marcus, to whatever remained of the Valecourt name, and he would do it without hesitation because hesitation was the first symptom of the disease that killed empires. But the Valecourts were her blood, rotten blood, poisoned blood, Blood that had humiliated her in front of 300 people and sold her to a man they feared because fear was the only transaction they still had credit for. But blood. And somewhere in the wreckage of that word, in the biological fact of shared origin, there existed a thread she could not sever without severing something inside herself that she was not yet ready to name. She made her decision before dawn. She would find the informant herself. She would trace the channel. She would map the full architecture of the conspiracy from the inside, using her family's betrayal as the entry point rather than the detonation charge. And when she had every name, every connection, every document that proved the scope of Whitmore's operation, she would bring it to Kaedric. Not as a wife confessing, as a strategist delivering intelligence. The difference mattered. She was learning that in this house, it always did. Morning came gray and bitter. December had locked the moors inside a shell of frozen mud and low cloud that turned the sky into a ceiling, pressing down on everything beneath it. The foundry smoke could not rise. It hung over the estate like a permanent bruise, thickening the air until even breathing felt industrial. Seraphina began her hunt with the staff. Ashcombe Hall employed 47 people: housekeepers, footmen, kitchen staff, stable hands, groundskeepers, and the small army of clerks and administrators who managed the Duke's correspondence and business operations. She had been Duchess for 7 weeks. She knew most of them by name and approximately half of them by temperament. The rest existed in the professional blur that large households cultivated deliberately because anonymity among servants was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. She started with access. Gerald's letter contained information from 3 distinct operational areas: coal transport, foundry production, and railway maintenance. No single servant had legitimate access to all 3, which meant either the informant held an unusually broad position or the information was being compiled from multiple sources and funneled through a single channel. "Mrs. Blackwood," Seraphina said that morning, catching the housekeeper in the corridor outside the kitchen, "I would like a complete roster of staff assignments for the past 6 months, including any temporary workers, contracted laborers, or visitors who were granted access to the estate office." Mrs. Blackwood's face performed the particular contortion of a woman who wanted to refuse but could not identify sufficient grounds. "May I ask the purpose, Your Grace?" "You may not." The roster arrived within the hour. Seraphina spread it across the desk in the estate office and began cross-referencing names against the operational areas compromised in Gerald's letter. Coal transport schedules were managed by Hargrove and 2 junior clerks. Foundry production figures were compiled weekly by the shift foreman and sent to the estate office for consolidation. Railway maintenance calendars were kept by the engineering department in a separate building adjacent to the main house. 3 systems, 3 access points, 1 leak. By noon, she had narrowed the field to 11 people who possessed either direct access or plausible proximity to all 3 information streams. By evening, she had eliminated 6 through schedule conflicts. The information in Gerald's letter referenced data from mid-October. 3 of the 6 had been absent from the estate during that period. The remaining 3 could not have accessed the railway maintenance records based on their assigned duties. 5 names remained. She wrote them on a separate piece of paper, folded it, and placed it in her dress pocket. Then she burned the working notes in the fireplace and watched the ash curl upward into the chimney draft. "Working late?" Kaedric appeared in the doorway. He had been in Sheffield all day inspecting the foundry that had suffered the boiler failure in September. His coat was dusted with soot. His face was drawn. He looked like a man who had spent 10 hours staring at the machinery that kept his world turning and wondering how many more revolutions it could sustain before something cracked. "Always," Seraphina said. He walked to the sideboard, poured whiskey, did not offer her one, which she had learned was not rudeness, but the assumption that she would take what she wanted without waiting for permission. She had learned to appreciate that assumption. It was the closest thing to respect the man seemed capable of offering. "The Sheffield boiler has been replaced," he said. "The new system is German, Krupp engineering, heavier than the British alternative, but rated for twice the pressure tolerance. And the cost? Irrelevant. Dead workers cost more than German steel, a fact my accountants understand intellectually, but refuse to internalize." He drank. "Hargrove tells me you requested the staff roster this morning." Seraphina did not flinch. "I did." For what purpose? Operational review. I am restructuring the information flow between departments to close the vulnerabilities I identified in the supply chain audit. It was not entirely a lie. It was a lie wearing the clothing of truth, which she had learned was the only kind that survived scrutiny from a man who processed deception the way other men processed oxygen. Kedrick studied her. The firelight threw shadows across his face that made his features look like they had been chiseled from the same black stone that built his house. His eyes moved across her expression with the systematic precision of a man reading a financial statement, looking not for what was present, but for what was missing. "You are hiding something," he said. "Everyone is hiding something. You taught me that." "I taught you nothing. You arrived already educated." He set down the glass. "When you're ready to tell me what you found, I will be in the West Wing." He left. His footsteps echoed down the corridor with the measured cadence of a man who never hurried because hurrying implied that circumstances controlled his timeline rather than the reverse. Seraphina exhaled. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. She spent the next 3 days watching the 5 remaining suspects with the patient intensity of a woman who understood that surveillance was not about seeing everything, but about seeing the one thing that did not belong. She adjusted her schedule to intersect casually with each of them. A question about laundry logistics to the upstairs maid. A request for filing supplies from the junior clerk. An inquiry about stable conditions from the head groom. Each interaction designed to establish baseline behavior so that any deviation would register like a wrong note in a familiar melody. The deviation came on the 4th day. Thomas Enfield, second clerk in the estate office, 31 years old, employed at Ashcombe Hall for 3 years, quiet, competent, unremarkable in the specific way that made him invisible in a household that valued efficiency over personality. Seraphina had noticed him during her first week and promptly forgotten him, which she now understood was exactly the point. She caught him in the correspondence room at 6:20 in the evening, 30 minutes after his shift ended. He was standing before the filing cabinet that contained the railway maintenance calendars. His hand was inside the drawer. His body was angled away from the door in the posture of a man who expected to be alone. "Mr. Enfield." He turned. The blood drained from his face in a wave so complete it looked like someone had pulled a plug at the base of his skull. His hand withdrew from the drawer holding nothing, which was almost worse than holding something because it meant he had not yet taken what he came for, which meant he would try again. "Your Grace." His voice was steady, but his throat moved. "I was filing the afternoon correspondence." The afternoon correspondence was filed at 4. I watched Hargrove complete it. There was an additional letter from the Sheffield office. "Show me." He blinked. "Your Grace?" "The letter from Sheffield. Show it to me." His hands moved to the desk beside the cabinet. He shuffled papers with the frantic efficiency of a man drowning in shallow water. "It seems I was mistaken. I believe Mr. Hargrove may have already—" "Mr. Enfield." Seraphina stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was small and absolute. "How much is Lord Whitmore paying you?" The silence that followed had weight. Physical, measurable weight that pressed down on the room like the low December sky, pressed down on the moors outside. Enfield's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: shock, calculation, and the specific despair of a man who realized that the chess game he thought he was playing had ended 6 moves ago, and he had not noticed. "I do not know what you— £30, 40. I am curious what the current market rate is for selling an employer's operational intelligence to his enemies. My own family sold me for considerably less, so I have no reliable benchmark." Enfield's jaw worked. His eyes moved to the door behind her, then to the window, then back to her face. He was measuring distances the way trapped animals measured distances, not looking for an exit, but calculating which option would result in the least damage. £50, he said finally. His voice had gone flat, defeated. 25 upon delivery. 25 when the information was confirmed accurate. Confirmed by whom? A man named Dalton. He meets me at the Crossed Keys in Harrogate on the 1st and 3rd Thursday of each month. I do not know who he reports to. I was told it was a commercial intelligence firm conducting competitive analysis. And you believe that? I believe £50. He looked at her with an expression that was neither defiant nor apologetic. It was exhausted. The face of a man who had been living inside a decision he regretted but could not reverse. I have a sister in Manchester. She has 3 children. Her husband died in a mill accident 2 years ago. The parish assistance covers rent, but nothing else. £50 means her children eat through winter. Seraphina felt something shift inside her chest. Not sympathy, something more dangerous. Recognition. She knew what it meant to make choices that decency could not afford. She knew the arithmetic of survival that reduced morality to a luxury item priced beyond the budget of ordinary desperation. She had watched her own father perform those calculations every day of her childhood, trading dignity for credit, selling pride by the pound until there was nothing left to sell except his daughter. "Sit down," she said. Enfield sat. His hands were shaking now. The performance of composure had collapsed, and beneath it was just a man. 31 years old, scared, doing something terrible for a reason that was not terrible at all. "You are going to continue meeting Dalton," Seraphina said. Enfield looked up. His face registered confusion so genuine it could not have been manufactured. "Your Grace, you will keep your schedule. 1st and 3rd Thursday. But the information you deliver will be information I provide. You will carry exactly what I give you, nothing more, nothing less. And when Lord Whitmore builds his strategy around intelligence that I have designed to destroy him, you will have earned something considerably more valuable than £50. "What?" "My silence." She leaned forward. "If I tell the Duke what you have done, your career ends tonight. Your name is destroyed. Your sister's children lose the only income keeping them alive. That is what disclosure costs. What I'm offering you is the opposite. Continue your role. Become my instrument instead of Whitmore's. And when this is over, you walk away clean. New position, new references, and a sum sufficient to ensure your sister's family is secure for 3 years. Enfield stared at her. His breathing was shallow. His eyes moved across her face the way Cadrick's did when he was reading someone for deception. And she realized with a cold thrill that she had learned that technique from a man who would be furious to know she was using it independently. "Why?" he whispered. "Why not just tell the Duke and let him handle it?" "Because the Duke handles things with a hammer, and this situation requires a scalpel." He swallowed. "If he finds out you kept this from him, then I will deal with that consequence when it arrives. Your concern is not the Duke. Your concern is me. Do we have an understanding, Mr. Enfield?" He nodded, slowly, like a man stepping onto ice and waiting to see if it would hold. "We have an understanding." Seraphina stood. She smoothed her skirt. She walked to the door and opened it and stepped into the corridor where the gas lamps threw her shadow long against the stone walls. Then she paused and looked back at him. "One more thing. The information channel through my brother Gerald. How many letters has he sent?" "3 that I know of. The last one arrived 4 days ago. Addressed to Whitmore directly. To Dalton, but the content referenced Whitmore's industrial operations. Names, dates, the assembly. The winter assembly?" "Yes." Seraphina closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor breathing. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with the force of a foundry piston, and for the first time since entering Ashcombe Hall, she understood why Cadrick valued control above all other qualities. Because when you held power, control was the only thing standing between the calculated application of force and the catastrophic release of everything you had spent your entire life learning to contain. She was running a double operation against her own family and her husband simultaneously, and one mistake in either direction would detonate everything. 2 weeks before the winter assembly, London began to sharpen itself. Reports arrived at Ashcombe Hall with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. Whitmore had secured parliamentary support for a formal inquiry into Ashcombe's railway contracts. The inquiry would allege improper bidding practices, bribery of Crown officials, and unauthorized dealings with foreign steel manufacturers. Forged evidence had been prepared. Witnesses had been purchased. The attack was designed to coincide with a coordinated financial strike from 3 banking houses that held notes on Ashcombe's railway operations. Cadrick absorbed the intelligence the way he absorbed everything. Quietly. Completely. With the systematic patience of a man cataloging ammunition before a battle he had known was coming for months. Whitmore believes the assembly will be an ambush, he told Seraphina one evening in the study. Maps covered the desk between them. Railway routes, financial networks, political alliances charted in ink on paper that smelled of lamp oil and cold strategy. He has arranged for the parliamentary committee to convene a special hearing during the assembly itself. Maximum exposure, maximum humiliation. He wants the aristocracy to watch me fall in real time. And the banking notes, called in simultaneously. 36 hours after the hearing begins, designed to create a liquidity crisis that forces emergency asset sales. How much exposure? £14,000 in callable notes across 3 institutions. Manageable under normal circumstances. Catastrophic if combined with a parliamentary freeze on my operating contracts. Seraphina studied the maps. The railway routes spread across the paper like veins in a body, and she could see what Whitmore intended. Cut the veins, bleed the body. Let Parliament hold the tourniquet while the banking houses collected the organs. He has also been contacting former Valecourt business associates, Seraphina said. She kept her voice level, clinical. The way she had learned to speak when the information she was delivering had the potential to burn. 3 families with historical ties to my father's shipping interests. He is reconstructing the Valecourt intelligence network to supplement his own. Kedrick looked at her. You know this how? Because I know my family, and I know that desperation does not make people creative. It makes them repetitive. Gerald will have contacted every Valecourt ally who still returns correspondence, offering information in exchange for the one thing he has wanted since the night you walked into that ballroom. Which is? Relevance. Gerald does not care about Whitmore's industrial ambitions. He cares about being seen as someone who matters, someone who influenced an outcome. The specific outcome is irrelevant. The sensation of significance is everything. Kedrick was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. A log shifted and sent a column of sparks up the chimney. You speak about your family the way I speak about supply chain vulnerabilities, he said. My family is a supply chain vulnerability. Something moved across his face. Not warmth. Not exactly. Something more like the recognition of a border being crossed, a line that separated employer from partner, arrangement from alliance. And on the other side of that line, something neither of them had vocabulary for yet. What are you not telling me, Seraphina? She met his eyes. The smoke gray of them. The intelligence burning behind them like the foundry fires that never went out, not even at midnight, not even in storms, because the machinery demanded constant heat, and the man who built the machinery had internalized that demand so completely that extinguishing himself had become structurally impossible. I'm telling you everything you need for the assembly, she said. Trust the timing. I trust timing. I do not trust gaps in intelligence from the one person in this house whose judgment I have not yet found a reason to question. Then consider the possibility that the gaps exist to protect you from reacting before the reaction serves you. His jaw tightened. She could see the mechanism working behind his eyes. The calculation. The assessment of whether this woman sitting across from him with firelight in her hair and steel in her voice was an asset or a threat, and the growing dangerous realization that she might be both simultaneously and that the combination was something he had no contingency for. The assembly is in 12 days, he said. I know. If Whitmore's operation succeeds, everything I have built collapses. The foundries, the railways, the contracts, the political leverage that keeps Parliament from taxing northern industry into extinction. All of it. I know. And you are asking me to trust timing. I'm asking you to trust me. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward into silence. Kedrick Ashcombe had not trusted another human being since his father died drunk in a house that no longer belonged to him, leaving a 19-year-old son with nothing except debts and the savage understanding that the world did not reward goodness. It rewarded capability. It rewarded ruthlessness. It rewarded the willingness to become something harder than the forces trying to destroy you. Trust was not hard. Trust was soft. And softness was the fracture point through which every empire he had ever studied had eventually been destroyed. But she was looking at him with those dark eyes that saw through ledgers and lies and the carefully maintained architecture of his control. And he understood with a clarity that felt like being struck that this woman was not asking for softness. She was asking for the one thing more difficult than ruthlessness. She was asking for collaboration. 12 days, he said. 12 days. He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Vulnerable, furious about the vulnerability. And somewhere beneath both, the raw and terrifying understanding that he had married a woman who was not his subordinate, not his opponent, but something the English language did not have a word for because English had been designed by men who never imagined a woman occupying this position. "If you are wrong," he said quietly, "we both burn. Then we burn together. That is the terms of the arrangement." He left. The corridor swallowed his footsteps. The fire settled, and Seraphina sat alone in the study with 12 days of planning ahead of her, and the knowledge that the document she had prepared for Enfield to deliver to Dalton at the Crossed Keys tomorrow evening contained enough fabricated intelligence to redirect Whitmore's entire assembly strategy toward a target that did not exist. She was building a trap with her family's betrayal as the bait. And in 12 days, at Wexmore Palace, in front of every political and industrial power in England, the trap would close. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because the information had not yet traveled through the channels that would eventually deliver it to Ashcombe Hall, was that Lord Cedric Whitmore had already anticipated the possibility of a counter-operation. His network was deeper than the single thread running through Enfield and Dalton. He had a second source, someone who did not appear on any staff roster, someone who did not work at Ashcombe Hall, someone whose access to the Duke's most closely guarded intelligence came not through employment, but through something far more difficult to detect. Someone who had sat across from Cedric Ashcombe at a negotiating table 6 years ago and never left. The carriage that arrived at Ashcombe Hall on the morning of December 23rd carried no crest. The man who stepped out of it wore a coat that cost more than most men earned in a year and a smile that never touched his eyes. His name was Aldrich Mercer, and he was Cedric's oldest surviving business partner, the man who had co-signed the first foundry purchase in Sheffield when Cedric was 19 years old and too young for banks to take seriously. He was also the man who had been selling Cedric's secrets to Whitmore for the past 18 months, and he had come to Ashcombe Hall to wish the Duke a Merry Christmas and to confirm, with his own eyes, that the weapon aimed at Cedric's empire was pointed at exactly the right place. He stepped through the front door smiling. Seraphina watched him from the upstairs window, and every instinct she had developed over 7 weeks of hunting traitors inside this house fired at once. Something about the way he moved, something about the angle of his arrival, something about the fact that nobody arrives unannounced at a fortress unless they are either desperate or certain of their welcome, and this man looked far too comfortable to be desperate. She pulled back from the glass. Her reflection stared at her from the cold window. Behind it, the foundry smoke climbed the December sky like a warning nobody had learned to read. 12 days. And the enemy was already inside the gates. Aldrich Mercer ate breakfast like a man who owned the table. He sat across from Cedric in the morning room with his napkin tucked into his collar and his knife working through a slab of cold beef with the casual precision of someone who had never questioned whether the food before him was earned or owed. His conversation was easy, practiced. The kind of warmth that had been rehearsed so many times it had fossilized into something indistinguishable from the real thing unless you knew where to press. Seraphina knew where to press. She had spent the previous night pulling every financial record connected to Mercer's name from the estate archives. The history was extensive. Mercer and Cedric had been entangled since the Sheffield foundry purchase 17 years ago. Co-signed loans, shared contracts, joint ventures in the early railway expansion that had multiplied both their fortunes before Cedric's empire outgrew the partnership, and Mercer settled into the comfortable role of senior associate. A man who no longer needed to build because proximity to the builder provided everything ambition required without any of the corresponding risk. The records were clean. Too clean. In 7 weeks of auditing Ashcombe's finances, Seraphina had learned that legitimate business always left scars. Disputed invoices, renegotiated terms, the ordinary friction of two entities grinding against each other over time. Mercer's accounts showed none of it. Every transaction was smooth, Every payment arrived on schedule. Every contract renewed without amendment. It was the financial equivalent of a room with no dust. Nobody lived there. Seraphina. Mercer smiled at her across the breakfast table. His teeth were very white. His eyes performed friendliness with the technical skill of an actor who had been playing the same role long enough to forget it was a performance. Kedrick tells me you have been revolutionizing his bookkeeping. I confess I am not surprised. The woman who silenced the Valecourt ballroom was never going to settle for needlework. I did not silence the ballroom, Seraphina said. Your partner did. Our partner. Mercer gestured between himself and Kedrick with his knife. 17 years, and the man still has not learned to enter a room without detonating it. Kedrick did not smile. He was reading correspondence and drinking coffee and giving the impression of a man only marginally aware that other people existed in the room, which Seraphina had learned was itself a performance. Kedrick was always aware. His inattention was a weapon deployed to make others speak more freely than they intended. What brings you to Ashcombe, Aldrich? Kedrick said without looking up. You hate Yorkshire in December. You told me so annually for 15 years. The Assembly. I wanted to discuss our position before we arrive at Wexmoor. Our position is unchanged. Whitmore will attack. We will respond. With what, specifically? Now Kedrick looked up. His eyes moved from the letter to Mercer's face with the slow, deliberate tracking of a gun turret adjusting its aim. With whatever the situation requires. You know I do not distribute strategy in advance, Aldrich. Strategies distributed are strategies compromised. Mercer laughed. It was a good laugh. Warm and full and carrying exactly the right amount of self-deprecation to suggest that he found his own curiosity endearing rather than suspect. Still the same suspicious bastard. 17 years and I am still not cleared for operational details. 17 years and you are still alive. Consider the correlation. The breakfast continued. Mercer asked about the foundry reconstruction, about the railway maintenance schedules, about the new German boiler systems. Each question casual, each question precisely aimed at the information Gerald's letters had already partially delivered. He was confirming data, cross-referencing, building a picture from the inside that his external channels could not complete. Seraphina ate toast and watched him work and felt something cold settle into the space behind her sternum. She had been hunting a traitor inside the household for weeks. She had found Enfield. She had turned him. She had built a counterintelligence operation designed to feed Whitmore fabricated data through the Dalton channel. And the entire time, the real threat had been sitting in a London office with 17 years of access and the kind of trust that Kedrick extended to no one else alive. She was looking at the weapon that would destroy them, and it was eating breakfast in their home. After the meal, Mercer announced he would tour the Sheffield foundry. Kedrick assigned a carriage and 2 estate guards, which was standard protocol for any visitor traveling through the industrial districts. Seraphina watched the carriage disappear down the frozen drive, then went directly to the estate office and locked the door. She pulled the Mercer financial files again. This time she was not looking for anomalies in the transactions. She was looking for absence, for the space between documented events where undocumented ones could hide. It took her 4 hours. The gap was in the transport ledgers. Mercer maintained a private shipping account through a firm called Redcliffe & Sons, based in Liverpool. The account appeared in Ashcombe records as a legitimate logistics provider used for secondary coal shipments. Routine. Unremarkable. Except that Redcliffe & Sons had been dissolved 18 months ago. The company no longer existed. Its registration had lapsed. Its offices were vacant. But payments from Mercer's accounts continued to flow into it on a monthly basis. 18 months. The same duration Whitmore's intelligence operation had been active. Seraphina stared at the numbers. The payments were modest, £200 per month, enough to fund a small operation, not enough to attract attention from an auditor reviewing thousands of transactions across a sprawling industrial empire. The money disappeared into a dissolved company like water into sand, untraceable unless you knew the sand was supposed to be solid ground. She sat back in the chair. The office was cold. The fire had died to embers while she worked, and she had not noticed because the temperature inside her had dropped to match. Aldrich Mercer was not just a passive informant. He was the architect. The Dalton channel, Enfield, Gerald's letters. All of it was scaffolding built around a central structure, and Mercer was the foundation. He had been feeding Whitmore strategic intelligence for 18 months using a financial channel hidden inside Ashcomb's own accounting system. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was stealing from a man who trusted him using the man's own money to fund the theft. And now he was inside the house, touring the foundries, counting the guards, measuring the defenses, confirming that the kill shot aimed at Kaedric's empire was calibrated to hit exactly where it would do the most damage. Seraphina closed the ledger. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She had two choices: tell Kaedric now and watch him destroy Mercer with the same systematic brutality he applied to every threat, or hold the information, integrate it into her existing operation, and use Mercer's presence as additional bait in the trap she was building for the assembly. The first option was safe, the second was better. But the second option required her to sit across from Aldrich Mercer at dinner that evening and smile while knowing that the man raising a glass to her husband's health was actively engineering her husband's annihilation. It required her to maintain a deception inside a deception, running a counter-operation against Whitmore through Enfield, while simultaneously concealing Mercer's betrayal from Kaedric until the moment when revealing it would cause maximum strategic damage to the enemy rather than maximum emotional damage to the man she had married. She chose the second option. And she understood, sitting in that freezing office with dead embers and living numbers, that the choice itself had changed something in her that could not be changed back. She was no longer the woman who had stood motionless in the Valecourt ballroom, absorbing humiliation with quiet dignity. She was something harder, something colder, something that operated in the space between loyalty and strategy, where the air was thin and the footing was treacherous, and one wrong step meant falling into a darkness that had no bottom. She had become, without intending to, and without fully recognizing the transformation, exactly the kind of person who survived in Kaedric Ashcomb's world. Mercer returned from Sheffield at dusk. Dinner was served at 6. The three of them sat in the dining room with candlelight throwing long shadows across the mahogany and conversation flowing with the deceptive ease of people who were all performing versions of themselves for audiences they assumed were not watching. "The new boiler system is impressive," Mercer said. "Krupp builds for permanence. The Sheffield operation will be the most efficient foundry in the north within 6 months." "Within 3, Kaedric corrected. "I do not operate on Mercer timelines." "No. You operate on Ashcombe timelines, which require everyone to function as though sleep were optional and human limitation were a character flaw." Mercer turned to Seraphina. "How do you manage it, living with a man who treats exhaustion as insubordination?" "I do not manage him," Seraphina said. "I outwork him. The distinction is important." Mercer laughed again, that same practiced, perfect laugh. "I can see why he married you. 2 of you in the same house must be terrifying for the staff." "The staff are efficient," Kaedric said. "Terror is unnecessary when expectations are clear. And when expectations are not met, then clarity is provided." Once, the conversation shifted to the assembly. Mercer raised the subject with the casual expertise of a man steering a ship toward rocks while maintaining the appearance of following the current. He asked about Kaedric's planned delegation, about travel arrangements, about which parliamentary allies would be attending. Each question delivered with the easy familiarity of a longtime partner discussing logistics over dinner. Seraphina watched Kaedric answer. He gave nothing operational, dates and names that were public knowledge, general assessments of the political landscape that any informed observer could have assembled from newspaper reports. He was feeding Mercer the same kind of controlled information she was feeding Enfield, and she realized with a jolt of cold recognition that Kaedric might already suspect. Not Mercer specifically, but something, some instinct tuned to frequencies that conscious analysis could not detect. The same instinct that had driven him to walk into the Valecourt masquerade without invitation. The same mechanism that calculated threat assessments in the spaces between words and decided, before the conscious mind caught up, whether the person across the table was prey or predator. After dinner, Mercer retired to the guest wing. Kaedric remained in the study. Seraphina found him standing before the fireplace with his hands behind his back and his face turned toward the flames with an expression she had never seen on him before. He looked tired. Not physically. Kaedric's body operated on a fuel source that seemed independent of sleep or rest, but behind the discipline and the iron posture and the face that revealed nothing. It did not choose to reveal. There was a weariness that came from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. It was the exhaustion of a man who had been at war for 17 years and had just realized that the war would never end because the enemies were not external forces to be defeated, but fundamental features of the landscape he had chosen to inhabit. "Sit down," Seraphina said. He did not sit. He turned from the fire and looked at her, and in the space between his eyes and hers, something passed that neither of them named, because naming it would have required admitting it existed. "Aldrich asked me about the Sheffield boiler replacement schedule," he said. "The specific dates, the installation sequence, the period during which the foundry will operate at reduced capacity." "And you told him?" "I told him what the schedule says. I did not tell him that I moved the installation forward by 2 weeks. The foundry will be at full capacity before the assembly, not after." Seraphina's pulse shifted. "You changed the timeline." "I changed it because someone has been providing my operational schedules to parties who should not have them. I do not yet know who, but I know the information is traveling because 3 decisions I made in private appeared in Whitmore's parliamentary filings within 10 days of execution." He knew. Not the details, not Mercer's name. But he knew the architecture was compromised, and he had been quietly adjusting the architecture to account for the leak without revealing that he knew the leak existed. They had been running parallel operations, both concealing, both protecting, both operating in the dark spaces of a marriage that was supposed to be a strategic alliance, but had become something far more complicated, something that required trust to function and made trust the most dangerous thing either of them could offer. "Kaedric." "Not yet." His voice was quiet, hard, the voice of a man holding something together through sheer mechanical force. "Whatever you are going to tell me, I need it at the right moment. Not the moment you feel ready. The moment it does the most damage to whoever is trying to take what I built." "How do you know I have something to tell you?" "Because you have not looked at me the same way since Aldrich arrived, and you are not a woman whose gaze shifts without cause." The fire cracked. A log collapsed into embers, and the sudden flare lit his face from below, turning his features into a mask of shadow and heat that looked less like a man and more like something forged in the same furnaces that built his empire. "The assembly," she said. "The assembly." "Everything. At the assembly. I will give you everything." He nodded. "Once." The movement was small and final and carried the weight of a man placing a bet so large that losing it would cost not money but identity. He was trusting her, actually trusting her, and the effort it required was visible in the tendons of his neck and the set of his jaw and the way his hands stayed locked behind his back as though releasing them would release something else he could not afford to let escape. Seraphina left the study. She walked to the east wing. She entered her bedroom and closed the door and stood in the darkness listening to her own breathing, and she understood that in 9 days she would either save Kaedric's empire or destroy his capacity to trust another human being for the rest of his life. And the margin between those 2 outcomes was thinner than the ice forming on the moor outside her window. The remaining days before the assembly compressed into a density that made normal time feel diluted. Seraphina met Enfield twice more. She provided him with fabricated intelligence designed to redirect Whitmore's parliamentary strategy toward a set of railway contracts that Kaedric had already restructured. The real contracts were buried under new corporate entities that did not appear in any filing Whitmore's team could access. The false contracts, the ones Enfield carried to Dalton, painted a picture of vulnerability that would encourage Whitmore to attack precisely where Ashcombe was strongest. Mercer departed on December 26th. He shook Kaedric's hand at the front door with the warmth of a man saying goodbye to the friend he was about to execute. His carriage disappeared into the frozen landscape, and Seraphina watched from the window and counted the days remaining. 9, 8, 7. She prepared documents, financial records reconstructed from the ledgers she had memorized during her first weeks at Ashcombe Hall, transaction histories showing the Redcliffe and Sons payments, correspondence timelines proving that Whitmore's intelligence appeared in parliamentary filings within days of Mercer's access to operational data. A chain of evidence so complete that presenting it would not merely expose the conspiracy, it would detonate it from the inside, turning every piece of intelligence Whitmore had gathered into proof of his own criminal coordination. 6, 5, 4. The night before departure, she could not sleep. She sat in the estate office one final time, reviewing her documents by candlelight, and heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Kedrick's. His steps were measured and deliberate. These were lighter, faster, uncertain. She opened the door. Enfield stood in the corridor. His face was the color of ash. His hands were trembling. "What happened?" she said. "Dalton did not come to the last meeting." His voice was a whisper cracking under its own weight. "A different man came. He did not give a name. He told me the arrangement was changing. He said Whitmore knows about the fabricated intelligence." Seraphina's blood cooled. Not gradually. Instantly. The way water freezes when it hits a surface cold enough to steal its heat before it can react. How? He did not say how. He said Whitmore has a second source, someone who verified the real schedules against what I was delivering and identified the discrepancies. Enfield's breathing was ragged. "Your Grace, if Whitmore knows the intelligence is fabricated, then he knows someone inside this house is running a counter-operation, and he will assume it is the Duke." But it was not the Duke. It was her. And Whitmore's second source, the one who had verified the real schedules against the fabricated ones, could only be someone with direct access to Kedrick's authentic operational data. Mercer. The trap she had built was compromised. The fabricated intelligence she had spent weeks engineering was useless. Whitmore knew it was false, which meant he would adjust his strategy, which meant the assembly attack would come from a direction she had not anticipated using weapons she had not mapped. And Kedrick did not know. He was sleeping in the West Wing, trusting her to deliver everything at the assembly, trusting her with the kind of trust that a man like him extended once in a lifetime, and never again if it was betrayed. She had 9 hours before the carriage departed for Wexmoor Palace. 9 hours to rebuild a strategy from wreckage. 9 hours to find a new way to expose Whitmore, neutralize Mercer, and protect Kedrick's empire using nothing except the documents in her hands and the intelligence in her head and the ruthless understanding that the only plans that survived contact with betrayal were the ones built from materials that betrayal could not corrupt. Facts. Numbers. The truth buried inside the lies. She sat down at the desk. She pulled the candle closer, and she began to work. Outside, the Yorkshire moors lay frozen beneath a sky so black and absolute that the stars looked like puncture wounds leaking light from some brighter world on the other side. The foundry fires burned on through the darkness. The steam engines breathed. And somewhere between Ashcombe Hall and London, Aldrich Mercer was riding toward Wexmoor Palace, carrying 17 years of trust he had converted into ammunition aimed at the heart of the only man who had ever believed in him. The assembly would begin at noon. And Seraphina Ashcombe, née Valecourt, the woman 300 aristocrats had watched being humiliated by her own family in a ballroom that smelled of champagne and cruelty, was about to walk into the most dangerous room in England with a plan she had built in 9 hours from the ruins of the one she had spent weeks constructing. She had no allies inside Wexmoor. She had no political connections. She had no aristocratic leverage. She had nothing except numbers that did not lie. And the absolute bone-deep certainty that the man sleeping 40 feet from her in the west wing of a fortress built from black stone and iron will deserve better than the destruction racing toward him from every direction, including directions he had never thought to guard because he had never imagined that the people closest to him would be the ones holding the blade. The candle burned down to a stub. She did not replace it. She worked in the dying light until the numbers were done and the documents were ready and the strategy was rebuilt from the only foundation that betrayal could never reach. The truth, stripped bare, ordinary and devastating and impossible to forge. She sealed the documents. She placed them inside her traveling case. She extinguished the candle, and she did not sleep. Wexmoor Palace rose from the frozen English countryside like a monument to the kind of wealth that had stopped pretending to serve any purpose beyond intimidation. Limestone columns, iron gates tall enough to admit a cathedral, grounds that stretched in every direction under a January sky the color of spent gunpowder. Carriages lined the approach road for half a mile, their breath-fogged horses standing in the cold, while footmen in royal livery guided England's most powerful men and women through doors designed to remind everyone entering that they were smaller than the architecture. Kedrick stepped out of the Ashcombe carriage and did not look at the building. He looked at the carriages, counting crests, reading the heraldic language of who had arrived, who had sent representatives, and who had chosen absence as a statement. His eyes moved across the procession with the mechanical precision of a man conducting reconnaissance on terrain he expected to become a battlefield within hours. Seraphina stepped out behind him. She wore dark blue, no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back with the severity she had adopted since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, the kind of arrangement that communicated not vanity, but intent. She carried a leather traveling case that contained every document she had assembled through 7 weeks of investigation, 9 hours of desperate reconstruction, and one sleepless night that had burned through the last reserves of the woman she used to be and left behind someone harder. Someone who did not yet have a name for what she had become, but understood that whatever it was built for exactly this kind of morning. "Whitmore is already inside," Kedrick said. He did not ask how she knew. He could read it in the carriages the same way she could. Mercer. Third carriage from the gate. The one without a crest. His jaw tightened. The movement was small, controlled, but she had spent enough time studying the mechanics of his face to recognize the difference between tension he chose and tension that chose him. "You said you would give me everything at the assembly." "I will." "We are at the assembly." "Not yet. The hearing does not begin until 2. I need to see who Whitmore positions in the chamber. I need to see who sits with him and who distances themselves. Alliances declared before battle begins are more reliable intelligence than anything written on paper." He looked at her. The smoke-gray eyes performed their systematic assessment, scanning her face for fracture, for hesitation, for the hairline crack that would tell him whether the woman he had trusted with the weight of his empire was about to buckle or hold. She held. They entered the palace. The receiving hall was a cathedral of political theater. 300 of England's most significant industrial, political, and aristocratic figures moved through a space designed to make human beings feel like furniture. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages, marble floors polished to a reflective sheen that turned every guest into a ghost, walking above their own inverted image. The noise was the specific hum of powerful people performing proximity to other powerful people. A sound that resembled conversation, the way a knife resembled a letter opener. Seraphina spotted Mercer within 30 seconds. He was standing near the east colonnade with a glass of champagne and the easy posture of a man attending a party rather than orchestrating a demolition. His smile was active. His eyes were not. They tracked Kedrick's entrance the way a hunter tracks movement in a tree line, not watching the target but watching the space the target would move through next. Whitmore was harder to locate. He had positioned himself in the library adjacent to the receiving hall, visible through open double doors but separated by the implied boundary of a different room. A man who wanted to be seen but not approached. A man staging himself as the audience rather than the aggressor, which meant the aggression would come from proxies. Seraphina counted those proxies. Sir Edmund Hale, parliamentary chair of the Industrial Oversight Committee, stood near Whitmore's perimeter with the rigid posture of a man who had been briefed and was waiting for his cue. Lord Ashford, a banking magnate whose institutions held callable notes on Ashcombe railway operations, occupied a window alcove speaking to 2 men in legal dress. 3 additional members of Parliament moved through the crowd in patterns that were too coordinated to be social. They were positioning, triangulating sightlines, establishing the geometry of an attack that would look spontaneous but had been engineered with the precision of military strategy. 6 proxies visible, Seraphina said quietly, standing beside Kedrick near a column that gave them vantage without exposure. Hale will chair the hearing. Ashford controls the financial trigger. The 3 parliamentary members will provide corroborating testimony. You mapped this in 4 minutes. I mapped this in 7 weeks. The 4 minutes confirmed it. A footman approached with champagne. Kedrick took a glass. Did not drink. Held it like a prop because men holding glasses were men performing normalcy, and normalcy was camouflage. "And Mercer," he said. The name landed between them like a blade dropped point first into wood. Seraphina felt the impact in her chest, not surprise. He had suspected. She had known he suspected. But hearing him say the name aloud, hearing the flatness in his voice, that meant the emotional processing had already been completed and only the tactical response remained, told her that the man standing beside her had arrived at Wexmoor Palace already knowing that his oldest surviving ally was the one holding the knife. "How long have you known?" she said. "Confirmed. 72 hours. Suspected. Longer." He paused. "The Redcliffe and Sons account. You found it." "I found the absence of it." Mercer referenced a Redcliffe shipment in a letter dated November. "The company was dissolved in March of last year. A living man does not write letters to a dead address unless the dead address is alive for purposes the living man does not want discovered." He looked at her. "You found it first?" 4 weeks ago. "And you did not tell me." "I was building a counter-operation through Thomas Enfield, your second clerk, who Whitmore had been paying £50 a month to deliver your operational intelligence through an intermediary named Dalton. I turned Enfield and began feeding fabricated data through the channel. The operation required Mercer to remain unaware that he was compromised so that his intelligence would contradict mine and force Whitmore to choose which source to trust." The silence between them lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Seraphina watched something happen behind Kedrick's eyes that she had never seen before and understood she might never see again. The machinery of his control faltered, not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer would detect. But she was not a casual observer. She was the woman who had spent 2 months learning to read the tectonic activity beneath his surface, and what she saw in those 3 seconds was the collision of 2 forces that his architecture was not designed to withstand simultaneously: fury and respect. "You ran a parallel intelligence operation inside my household," he said. His voice was level. The levelness was the most dangerous sound she had ever heard from him. "Without my knowledge, without my authorization, using my own compromised employee as your instrument." "Yes." "And the fabricated intelligence. Compromised. Whitmore's second source, which is Mercer, verified the real schedules against my false ones and identified the discrepancies. Whitmore knows the Enfield channel was turned. He adjusted his strategy. The attack coming today will not follow the plan we anticipated." "You are telling me this now." "I am telling you this now because the counter-operation failed, and the original intelligence I gathered through the investigation remains valid. I have documents proving Mercer's financial channel to Whitmore through the dissolved Redcliffe account. I have transaction histories, correspondence timelines, and a chain of evidence connecting Whitmore's parliamentary filings to information that could only have originated from Mercer's direct access to your operations, which you are carrying in that case, which I have memorized. The case contains the supporting documentation. But if the case is lost, stolen, or destroyed, I can reconstruct every figure, every date, and every transaction from memory. I audited your books for 7 weeks, Kedrick. I do not forget numbers." He stared at her. The receiving hall hummed around them. 300 people performed their roles in the theater of English power, unaware that the 2 people standing near the east column were conducting a conversation that would determine whether the most significant industrial empire in the north survived the afternoon. "You should have told me about Mercer the moment you confirmed it." "If I had told you the moment I confirmed it, you would have destroyed him immediately, visibly, publicly, and Whitmore would have known his primary intelligence channel was exposed and shifted to contingency plans we could not anticipate. I needed Mercer operational so that the false intelligence I was feeding through Enfield would create contradictions in Whitmore's data that weakened his strategy from the inside. That strategy failed. The channel failed. The intelligence did not. Whitmore spent 3 weeks building a parliamentary case around information I engineered to target railway contracts that no longer exist under the corporate structures he can access. His forged ledgers reference entities I restructured. His bribed witnesses will testify about transactions that occurred under terms I altered. The fabricated intelligence may be exposed, but the damage it did to his preparation is already embedded. He built a weapon aimed at a target I moved. Kedrick's breathing changed, not faster, deeper. The rhythm of a man absorbing impact and redistributing the force across a structure designed to take damage without collapsing. "The hearing begins in 90 minutes, he said. "I know." Whitmore will present forged evidence of treasonous dealings with foreign steel manufacturers. He will call witnesses, he will demand parliamentary investigation and asset seizure. And I will destroy every piece of it, document by document, witness by witness, using Mercer's own financial trail as the detonation charge. When I present the Redcliffe evidence, it will not merely prove that Whitmore's intelligence was corrupted. It will prove that his primary source was a plant inside your organization who was simultaneously stealing from you and defrauding Parliament. Every piece of evidence Whitmore presents becomes evidence of his own conspiracy. You are going to testify. I'm going to do considerably more than testify. His eyes narrowed. Something shifted in the geometry of his expression. The fury was still there, burning in the deep registers of his control like the foundry fires that never went out. But beside it, growing through it like steel cooling into its final shape, was something else. Recognition. Not of her competence, which he had recognized within days of their marriage, but of her nature. The actual architecture of who she was beneath the composure and the severity and the dark blue dress that carried no jewelry because jewelry was ornamentation, and ornamentation was a distraction from function. She was not his subordinate. She was not his opponent. She was not his wife in the ornamental sense that English society used the word. She was his operational equal, and she had proven it by running a covert intelligence operation under his roof without his knowledge, and arriving at the most dangerous moment of his career with a strategy he had not anticipated built from materials he had not known she possessed. 90 minutes, he said. I need 60. Give me access to Sir Edmund Hale before the hearing begins. Hale chairs the committee. He is Whitmore's proxy. Hale chairs the committee because Whitmore promised him a cabinet position. But Hale's banking interests are exposed to Ashcombe railway contracts through secondary holdings his public disclosures do not reflect. If your empire collapses, Hale loses £11,000 in investments he has hidden from Parliament. He is not Whitmore's ally. He is Whitmore's hostage. And hostages, when shown the door, tend to run. Cadric looked at her for a long moment. The receiving hall moved around them. Champagne glasses clinked. Voices murmured. Power performed its ancient rituals of proximity and pretension, and in the middle of it, two people who had married as strangers and become something the English language had no adequate word for stood beside a marble column and made decisions that would reshape the industrial landscape of a nation. You will have your 60 minutes, he said. And Seraphina. Yes. When this is over, you and I are going to have a conversation about the operational boundaries of our partnership that will make the Whitmore hearing look civilized. I look forward to it. He almost smiled. Almost. The expression made it halfway to his eyes before the machinery caught it and redirected the energy toward whatever internal furnace powered his capacity to function under conditions that would have broken lesser structures. Seraphina took the 60 minutes and used 40. She found Hale in a private sitting room adjacent to the library, reviewing notes with the nervous energy of a man about to perform a role he had rehearsed but did not fully believe in. His hands were damp. His collar was too tight. He had the specific pallor of a man who understood that the hearing he was about to chair would either elevate him permanently or destroy him catastrophically, with no middle ground. Sir Edmund. She entered without knocking. She closed the door behind her. She stood between him and the exit with the posture of a woman who had decided that this conversation would end on her terms, regardless of how it began. My name is Seraphina Ashcombe. I believe you are planning to chair a hearing this afternoon designed to dismantle my husband's empire. Hale's face went through the same progression she had seen on Enfield's face weeks ago in the correspondence room at Ashcombe Hall. Shock, calculation, despair. Your Grace, I am not at liberty to discuss your secondary holdings in Ashcombe Railway Securities total £11,400, distributed across 3 institutional accounts that do not appear in your parliamentary financial disclosures. If the hearing you are about to chair results in asset seizure against my husband, those securities become worthless. If the securities become worthless, the discrepancy between your reported holdings and your actual holdings becomes subject to parliamentary review. And if that review occurs, Sir Edmund, it will not be my husband facing charges of financial impropriety. It will be you. Hale's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. He looked like a fish pulled from water and placed on a surface it had not evolved to navigate. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want you to chair the hearing fairly. Allow evidence from both parties. Do not suppress testimony or documentation that contradicts the narrative you were briefed to support. And when the hearing concludes, you will vote based on what is presented rather than what you were paid to conclude. Whitmore will destroy me. Whitmore is about to have problems considerably larger than you, Sir Edmund. I would suggest repositioning yourself on the correct side of what is coming before the repositioning is done for you." She left him sweating in the sitting room and walked back through the receiving hall and found Kaedric standing exactly where she had left him, holding the same glass of champagne he had not touched. Watching the crowd with the focused stillness of a man who had decided that the next 2 hours would determine whether the empire he had spent 17 years building would survive or burn. "Done," she said. "Hail. Neutralized. He will chair the hearing without bias. Whether he votes with us is uncertain, but he will not suppress evidence." The bells of Wexmore Palace struck 2. The sound rolled through the marble corridors like artillery ranging before the barrage. Doors opened. Footmen directed traffic. 300 guests filtered from the receiving hall toward the parliamentary chamber on the building's east wing, where tiered seating surrounded a central floor designed for exactly the kind of political theater about to unfold. Kaedric and Seraphina walked toward the chamber together, side by side, neither leading, neither following. The crowd parted for them the way crowds always parted for Kaedric, with the instinctive deference of organisms recognizing something more dangerous than themselves. But today the deference had a different quality. Today the crowd was parting for 2 of them, and the space that opened in their path was wider and quieter, and carried the specific silence of people who sensed that what was about to happen would be remembered longer than anything else that occurred inside this building. The chamber was full, every seat occupied. Standing room claimed by men who had not been allocated seats but refused to miss whatever was about to unfold. Whitmore sat in the front row of the Eastern Gallery, flanked by legal counsel and 2 parliamentary allies, whose names Seraphina had memorized from the forged correspondence she had intercepted through Enfield's channel. Mercer sat 3 rows behind him, positioned at sufficient distance to suggest independence while maintaining direct sightlines to his principal. Hale took the chairman's seat on the elevated platform. His face was composed. His hands were not. He called the session to order with a voice that cracked once on the word inquiry before steadying into the practiced cadence of parliamentary procedure. This special hearing of the Industrial Oversight Committee has been convened to examine allegations of improper contract practices and unauthorized foreign dealings by Ashcombe Industries. Hale read from a prepared statement. His eyes flickered to Seraphina once, then back to the page. "Lord Whitmore, you may present your case." Whitmore stood. He was tall, lean, built from the kind of aristocratic confidence that came from centuries of bloodline rather than decades of effort. His voice was measured, calm, the voice of a man who believed the outcome was already decided, and the hearing was merely the ceremony surrounding the execution. "Distinguished members, the evidence I present today will demonstrate that Duke Ashcombe has engaged in systematic fraud against the Crown through unauthorized contracts with foreign steel manufacturers, bribery of parliamentary officials, and the deliberate manipulation of railway charter regulations to maintain an illegal monopoly over northern transport infrastructure." He presented ledgers, correspondence, witness depositions, each document delivered with the polished confidence of a prosecution that had rehearsed its case until the rehearsal felt like fact. The forged evidence was excellent, detailed, specific, loaded with the kind of financial minutiae that made fabrication difficult to detect without access to the authentic records it was designed to replace. The chamber murmured. Heads turned. Eyes moved between Whitmore's presentation and Kaedric's face, searching for the crack, the flinch, the involuntary reaction that would confirm guilt before the evidence finished speaking. Kaedric gave them nothing. He sat motionless. His face was stone. His eyes tracked Whitmore's movements with the predatory patience of a man who had learned very young that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was not the attack, but the space between the attack and the response, because that space was where discipline lived and discipline was the difference between survival and annihilation. Whitmore finished. The chamber held its breath. Hale looked at Cadric. "Your Grace, you may respond." Cadric stood. He adjusted his coat. He looked at the chamber with an expression that 300 people would later describe in 300 different ways, but that Seraphina recognized instantly as the face of a man who had just decided to stop playing defense. "I yield my response time," he said, "to the Duchess of Ashcombe." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in the specific silence that preceded noise, the intake of air before the explosion, the moment between the match and the powder. 300 faces turned toward Seraphina with expressions ranging from incredulity to outrage to the particular fascination of people who had just realized they were watching something that had never happened before in the history of English parliamentary procedure. A woman, responding to a formal hearing, on behalf of a duke. Seraphina stood. She carried no notes, no documents, no prepared statement. She walked to the chamber floor with her hands empty and her spine straight, and the absolute terrifying certainty that the next 15 minutes would either save everything or end everything, and that the margin between those outcomes was exactly the width of her nerve. "Distinguished members," she said. Her voice filled the chamber without effort. Not loud, clear. The clarity of a blade so sharp it did not need force to cut. "Lord Whitmore has presented 23 documents in support of his allegations. I will address each one, but first, I would like to introduce a name that Lord Whitmore has carefully avoided mentioning throughout his presentation. Aldrich Mercer." Mercer's face, 3 rows behind Whitmore. The transformation was instant and total. The easy confidence collapsed. The practiced warmth evaporated. What remained was the raw, exposed face of a man who had just heard his name spoken in the one room where he had been absolutely certain it would not be. "Aldrich Mercer has served as Duke Ashcombe's senior business associate for 17 years, Seraphina continued. "During the last 18 of those months, Mr. Mercer has also served as Lord Whitmore's primary intelligence source, transmitting Ashcombe operational data through a financial channel disguised as payments to a dissolved shipping company called Redcliffe and Sons." The chamber shifted. Not murmurs. Movement. The physical redistribution of attention as 300 people turned from Whitmore's presentation to the woman on the chamber floor who was systematically deconstructing it. The ledgers Lord Whitmore presented reference contract terms that were restructured 6 weeks ago under new corporate entities. The correspondence references transaction dates that do not align with Ashcombe's actual operational calendar, because those dates were drawn from fabricated intelligence I personally designed and delivered through a compromised channel that Lord Whitmore believed was authentic. And the witness depositions reference individuals whose financial relationships with Lord Whitmore. I can document through 18 months of payment records that I will now recite from memory, because the woman Lord Whitmore dismissed as an ornamental duchess spent 7 weeks auditing every number in the Ashcombe Empire and does not forget a single one. She began, date by date, transaction by transaction, figure by figure, not reading, not referencing notes, reciting from the architecture of numbers she had built inside her mind during those weeks of candlelit auditing in the estate office at Ashcombe Hall. Each number was a brick. Each date was mortar. And the structure she assembled on the chamber floor was not merely a defense. It was a counter-prosecution so complete that by the time she reached the 7th document, Whitmore's legal counsel had stopped writing and started staring. Mercer stood. His chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound like something tearing. He moved toward the door. 2 parliamentary guards, positioned there by Hale's quiet instruction before the hearing began, blocked his path. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," Hale said from the chairman's seat. His voice had found its strength. The strength of a man who had chosen the correct side just in time and intended to ride that choice as far as it would carry him. Mercer sat. His face was gray. His hands gripped the arms of his chair with the desperate force of a man holding on to the last solid surface in a world that had just liquefied beneath him. Seraphina continued, document by document, allegation by allegation, each one dismantled not with rhetoric but with numbers, raw, unchallengeable, mathematically verifiable numbers that turned Whitmore's fabricated evidence into proof of his own conspiracy. When she reached document 23, the chamber was silent with the absolute silence of 300 people who had just watched the most comprehensive destruction of a parliamentary case in living memory, delivered by a woman who had been publicly humiliated by her own family 3 months ago, and was now standing in the most powerful room in England, reciting financial records from memory with the precision of a weapon that had been forged specifically for this moment. Whitmore's face had gone from composed to rigid to something beyond rigidity, something that looked like a man watching his own execution from inside the body being executed. Then Kaedric stood. The chamber turned to him. He walked to the floor. He stood beside Seraphina, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. The positioning was deliberate, and every person in the room understood it. "Before this committee responds to what the Duchess has presented," he said, "I have one additional action to place on record." He paused. The pause was calibrated. The pause was a weapon. "I am transferring 50% of all Ashcombe industrial holdings, effective immediately, into the name of Seraphina Ashcombe, Duchess of Ashcombe. Railways, foundries, coal operations, textile mills, half the empire, in her name, under her authority." The chamber did not gasp. The chamber detonated. 300 voices erupted simultaneously. Chairs scraped. Men stood. The sound crashed against the marble walls and rebounded and crashed again like waves inside a stone basin. Hale hammered for order and received none. Whitmore stood in the chaos. His legal counsel grabbed his arm. He shook it off. His face was the face of a man who had built a strategy to destroy one opponent and discovered at the moment of execution that the opponent had multiplied. And in the gallery above the chamber floor, unseen by most but visible to Seraphina because she had been tracking every face in the room since the moment she stood, Aldrich Mercer was moving again. Not toward the door this time. Toward a man standing in the shadow of the upper colonnade. A man she did not recognize. A man who handed Mercer a folded piece of paper and disappeared into the crowd before the parliamentary guards could register his presence. Mercer read the paper. His face changed. Not to despair. To something worse. To calculation. The face of a man who had just received new instructions and was deciding whether the cost of following them was lower than the cost of refusal. He looked down at the chamber floor. He looked directly at Kaedric. And in his eyes, Seraphina saw something that turned her blood to ice. He was not finished. The paper in his hand was not a retreat order. It was an escalation. And whatever it contained, whatever final weapon Whitmore's network had kept in reserve for exactly this contingency, was about to be deployed in a room full of the most powerful people in England while the echo of Kaedric's declaration still rang off the marble walls. Seraphina reached for Kaedric's arm. Her fingers closed around his sleeve. He looked at her. She looked at the gallery. His eyes followed hers. Found Mercer. Found the paper. Found the expression. His face did not change, but his body shifted. The weight redistributed. The stance widened. The mechanical adjustment of a man whose survival instincts had just detected incoming fire and was bracing for impact before the conscious mind could calculate the trajectory. The chamber was still in chaos. Hale was still hammering. 300 voices were still processing the detonation of a transfer that had just rewritten the power structure of English industry. And above them all, Aldrich Mercer folded the paper into his coat pocket and began walking toward the stairs that led down to the chamber floor, carrying whatever final devastation that note contained directly toward the two people standing at the center of the storm. Mercer reached the chamber floor in 11 steps. Seraphina counted them, because counting kept the panic mechanical, kept it in the part of her brain that processed numbers instead of the part that processed dread. 11 steps from the gallery stairs to the central floor where she and Kaedric stood, surrounded by 300 people who had not yet realized that the explosion they were still processing was merely the preliminary charge. The real detonation was walking toward them in a tailored coat with a folded piece of paper in his pocket and 17 years of betrayal behind his eyes. Hale was still hammering for order. The chamber had not recovered from Kaedric's transfer declaration. Men stood in clusters arguing about legal precedent and industrial implications and whether a duke could unilaterally divide an empire during a parliamentary hearing. The noise was enormous, chaotic, and inside that chaos, Mercer moved with the terrible calm of a man who understood that disorder was cover and cover was opportunity. He stopped 10 feet from Kaedric. "You always did have a flair for theater," Mercer said. His voice carried across the chamber floor with a clarity that cut through the noise like a blade through canvas. Conversations died in expanding circles around him. Heads turned. The chamber began to realize that whatever had just happened was not the end of the performance, but the intermission. Kedrick did not move. His body held the loaded stillness of a man whose every muscle was engaged in the specific discipline of not reacting until the reaction served a purpose greater than the impulse demanding it. "Aldrich," he said. Just the name. Nothing else. The single word carried the weight of 17 years of shared history, shared risk, shared meals in Sheffield boarding houses, when neither of them could afford separate rooms, and the Foundry purchase was still a gamble that rational men would have abandoned. The name was not a greeting, it was an obituary. "The Duchess gave an impressive performance," Mercer continued. He glanced at Seraphina. "The Redcliffe account. The payment timelines. Very thorough. I genuinely did not expect that level of forensic commitment from a woman who has been in this family for 3 months. Say what you came to say, Aldrich." "What I came to say." Mercer reached into his coat. His hand emerged holding the folded paper. He did not open it. He held it between his fingers, the way a card player holds a final card, displayed but not yet played because the anticipation of the reveal was itself a weapon. "What I came to say is that the Duchess's evidence is accurate. Every transaction, every date, every payment through Redcliffe, all of it real, all of it mine." The chamber went silent. Not the gradual silence of fading conversation, but the instantaneous silence of 300 people collectively holding their breath. "I have been providing Lord Whitmore with Ashcombe operational intelligence for 18 months, Mercer said. "And I did it because 18 months ago you made a decision that told me exactly what kind of man you had become. And it was not the kind of man I signed that first loan with in Sheffield." Kedrick's jaw shifted. The movement was millimeters. Seraphina saw it because she was standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, the furnace inside him burning at a temperature that should have been visible to the room, but was contained by a discipline so absolute it functioned like armor. "The Harrogate miners," Mercer said, 18 months ago. 47 men petitioned for safer working conditions in the deep shafts. They submitted the petition through proper channels. They followed every procedure. They asked for ventilation improvements that would have cost your operation £1,100 annually. You denied the petition. 6 weeks later, a shaft collapse killed 9 of them. The shaft collapse was caused by geological instability that no ventilation system would have prevented, Kedrick said. His voice was flat, mechanical. The voice of a man reciting a fact he had recited before, and would recite again because facts were the foundation he built everything on, and foundations did not change because someone pointed at them with emotion. The shaft collapse was caused by geological instability that your own engineers flagged in a report you buried because addressing it would have delayed production by 3 weeks. Mercer's voice had dropped. The performance was gone. The practiced warmth was gone. What remained was something raw and damaged and furious. "I read that report, Kedrick. I read it because I still had access to your filing system, and I read it because when 9 men die in a hole in the ground and the man who put them there calls it geological instability, someone should at least look at the paperwork." The chamber was frozen. 300 people were watching the most intimate and savage confrontation they had ever witnessed in a political setting, and none of them could look away because the destruction unfolding on the chamber floor was not political. It was personal. It was 2 men who had once trusted each other standing in the wreckage of that trust and showing the room exactly what the wreckage looked like from the inside. Seraphina felt the impact land, not on her, on Kedrick. She felt it in the micro-shift of his posture, the fractional redistribution of weight that told her something inside his structural integrity had just taken damage that discipline alone could not absorb. The engineer's report, he had buried it. She had not found it in her audit because buried documents did not appear in the filing system she had access to. Mercer had found it because Mercer had 17 years of access and the specific knowledge of where Kedrick hid the things he did not want examined. "So I made a choice," Mercer continued. "I could confront you directly and watch you dismiss me the way you dismiss everything that challenges your methodology. Or I could find someone with enough power to force the change you would never make voluntarily. Whitmore offered that power. His motives are commercial. Mine were not. But the vehicle was available, and the destination was the same. The destination, Kedrick said, and his voice had changed, was the destruction of everything I built. The destination was accountability, something you eliminated from your vocabulary the moment you became too powerful for anyone to demand it. Mercer unfolded the paper. He held it up. Not for Kedrick, for the chamber. This is a list, he said, of every safety petition, engineering report, and worker grievance that Duke Ashcombe has suppressed, denied, or buried in the last 5 years. 47 documents, representing the voices of over 300 workers whose concerns were treated as operational inconveniences rather than human emergencies. I compiled this list over 18 months of access, and I am entering it into the parliamentary record. He placed the paper on the hearing table. The chamber erupted. Seraphina stood in the center of the detonation and watched two realities collide inside her at a speed that made rational thought impossible for approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she understood 3 things simultaneously. First, that Mercer's evidence was real and its implications were devastating. Second, that Whitmore's conspiracy and Mercer's crusade were separate operations using the same channel for entirely different purposes, and she had spent 7 weeks treating them as one entity when they were 2. Third, that the man standing beside her, the man she had married for survival and served for strategy and defended with every weapon her intelligence could manufacture, had made decisions that cost human lives and concealed the evidence from the systems designed to prevent exactly that. The 4 seconds ended. Rational thought resumed. And with it came the understanding that the next 60 seconds would determine not just the survival of Ashcombe Industries, but the kind of survival it would be. Because there were 2 ways to survive an accusation this fundamental. You could destroy the accuser, or you could absorb the blow. Destroying Mercer was tactically simple. His conspiracy with Whitmore was documented. His methods were illegal. His evidence was gathered through theft and betrayal. Any competent legal response could bury his testimony under the weight of his own criminal conduct. But burying testimony did not make the testimony false. And 300 workers with suppressed grievances did not stop existing because the man who spoke for them was compromised. Seraphina looked at Kedrick. His face was the face she had seen that first night in the Valecourt ballroom. Stone, absolute. The architecture of a man who had been built by forces that did not include tenderness and had never been rebuilt by anything softer. He was calculating. She could see the machinery working behind his eyes, measuring the damage, assessing the counterattack, mapping the trajectory of the weapon Mercer had just deployed, and identifying the precise angle of response that would neutralize it with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. He was going to destroy Mercer. She could see it forming, the words assembling behind his expression like ammunition loading into a chamber. He was going to stand in front of 300 people and dismantle Aldrich Mercer the way he had dismantled every threat for 17 years, with precision and brutality and the absolute confidence that power applied correctly could crush anything. And he would be wrong. Kedrick. She said his name quietly, not for the chamber, for him. Do not. He looked at her. The machinery paused, the ammunition held. He just handed them the weapon that kills us, he said. His voice was barely audible beneath the chaos of the chamber. He handed them the truth. You cannot kill truth. You can only decide what you do when it arrives. What I do is survive. That is what I have always done. Surviving is not the same as deserving to survive, and right now this room is deciding which one you are. His breathing changed. She watched it happen. The deep, controlled rhythm that had carried him through the hearing fractured into something irregular, something human, something that belonged to a man standing at the edge of the identity he had constructed over 17 years and realizing that the edge was not a boundary, but a cliff. Hale was calling for order. The chamber was settling. 300 faces were turning back toward the floor, waiting for the Duke's response with the collective appetite of a society that consumed its powerful the way it consumed everything else, with enthusiasm and without mercy. Kedrick looked at the hearing table, at Mercer's list, 47 documents, 300 workers, 9 dead men in a shaft that an engineering report had predicted would fail. He looked at Seraphina, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before. Not vulnerability, not the controlled simulation of vulnerability that powerful men deployed when they wanted to appear human without actually being human. Real fracture. The kind that happened when the internal structure a person had built to hold themselves together encountered a force it was not designed to withstand. Not an external force, an internal one. The truth about who he had become. He stepped forward. The chamber went silent. "The documents Mr. Mercer has entered into the record," Kadrick said. His voice was steady. The steadiness was not control. It was something else. Something that had never existed in his voice before because it had never been required. It was the steadiness of a man speaking without armor for the first time in his adult life. "The documents are authentic. The engineering reports were suppressed. The safety petitions were denied. The decisions were mine." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had preceded it. This was not the silence of anticipation or shock or political calculation. This was the silence of 300 people who had expected a counterattack and received a confession. "I built Ashcombe Industries on the principle that weakness invited destruction," Kadrick continued. "That principle generated wealth. It generated power. It generated the empire that employs 12,000 workers across the North and sustains the railway infrastructure that this committee relies upon for national commerce. It also generated a system in which the voices of the men who built that empire with their hands were treated as operational noise to be managed rather than human communication to be heard. That system was my design. Its consequences are my responsibility." He paused. His hands were at his sides, open, not clenched. The openness was deliberate, and it cost him something visible, something that showed in the tendons of his forearms and the set of his shoulders, and the way his breathing had gone shallow in the specific pattern of a man whose body was fighting his mind's decision to stand exposed. Mr. Mercer's methods were criminal. His alliance with Lord Whitmore was a conspiracy to destroy my enterprise for commercial gain disguised as moral purpose. Those facts are documented and will be addressed through appropriate legal channels. He looked at Mercer directly. Without the systematic assessment or the predatory calculation or any of the mechanical processes that had defined the way Kadrick Ashcombe looked at other human beings for as long as Seraphina had known him. He looked at Mercer the way a man looks at the mirror that showed him the face he had been avoiding. But the information he gathered is real, and the men whose grievances were suppressed deserve better than having their voices discredited because the messenger who carried them was compromised. He turned back to the committee. "I am proposing, before this body, the establishment of an independent safety commission for all Ashcombe industrial operations, funded by the company, staffed by engineers and worker representatives, empowered to halt any operation deemed unsafe without requiring approval from ownership or management. The commission will report directly to this committee on a quarterly basis." The chamber stirred, not with outrage, with something more complex, the sound of 300 people recalibrating their understanding of a man they thought they knew. "Additionally," Kadrick said, "the 47 suppressed documents will be released in full to the committee and to the workers they concern. Every grievance will receive formal review. Every denied petition will be reconsidered. And the families of the 9 men who died in the Harrogate shaft collapse will receive compensation commensurate not with the operational cost of their deaths, but with the human cost, which I am aware cannot be accurately calculated. But the attempt matters more than the precision." He stopped. The chamber held. Hale sat motionless in the chairman's seat, his gavel forgotten in his hand, his face showing the expression of a man who had prepared for political warfare and found himself witnessing something that political vocabulary did not have a category for. Whitmore stood. His face was ashen. The architecture of his attack had been dismantled twice in the same afternoon, first by Seraphina's financial evidence and then by Kadrick's confession, which had stolen the moral high ground Whitmore's conspiracy was supposed to claim and relocated it to the very man it was designed to destroy. "This is theater," Whitmore said. His voice was thin, desperate, the voice of a man reaching for a weapon and finding his hands empty. A calculated performance designed to deflect from "Lord Whitmore," Seraphina's voice cut across the chamber. "Your forged ledgers are documented. Your bribed witnesses are identified. Your financial conspiracy with Mr. Mercer is traced through 18 months of payments to a dissolved company. If you would like to continue this hearing, I am prepared to enter each of those items into the parliamentary record with the same specificity I demonstrated earlier. Or you may sit down. Whitmore sat down. The motion was involuntary, the kind of sitting that happened when the legs decided independently of the brain that standing was no longer structurally supportable. Hale cleared his throat. This committee will adjourn to consider the evidence and proposals presented. All documents will be entered into the formal record. A ruling will be issued within 30 days. He paused. This hearing is concluded. The gavel fell. The chamber erupted into motion. Men stood, gathered papers, clustered into groups that reconfigured in real time as alliances adjusted to the new landscape. Whitmore's legal counsel was already moving toward the exit. Whitmore himself remained seated, staring at the hearing table with the hollow expression of a man whose empire had not been destroyed by force, but by the removal of the ground it stood on. Mercer had not moved. He sat in his chair on the chamber floor with his hands folded and his face showing something Seraphina could not immediately categorize. Not triumph, not defeat, something that lived in the territory between them. The face of a man who had set fire to a building to expose its rotten foundations and was now sitting in the ashes trying to determine whether the fire had been worth what it consumed. Cadric walked to him. The two men faced each other. 17 years of history compressed into the space between their bodies. Sheffield, the first foundry, the shared rooms, the early loans signed on kitchen tables, the slow divergence as one man's empire grew and the other man's relevance shrank, and the distance between them filled with resentment disguised as loyalty until the disguise could no longer hold. You should have come to me, Cadric said. I did, 3 times. You were not listening. I was not listening because listening required changing, and changing required admitting that the system I built had flaws I could not fix without dismantling parts of myself I needed to function. And now I have dismantled them in front of 300 people. So the question of whether I needed them is no longer relevant. Mercer looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. The nod was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. The recognition of 2 men who had damaged each other irreparably and understood that the damage was the only honest thing left between them. The Safety Commission, Mercer said. Make it real, not a performance. I do not perform, Aldrich. I execute. I know, that is what made you dangerous, and what made you worth betraying. Mercer stood. He walked toward the chamber exit. At the doorway he paused and looked back, not at Cadric, at Seraphina. His expression held something she recognized because she had felt it herself during those first days at Ashcombe Hall. Surprise at finding competence where he expected ornamentation. Respect arrived at through the specific route of having been defeated by someone he underestimated. Then he was gone. The chamber emptied slowly. Seraphina and Cadric stood on the floor until only Hale and a few clerks remained, gathering documents and extinguishing lamps. The afternoon light through the tall windows had gone amber. The color of endings. The color of things that had burned down to their essential elements and could now be examined without the distortion of flame. They walked out of Wexmore Palace into January air, so cold it felt like being slapped by something that did not care whether you were a duke or a beggar. The carriages were departing. Hooves on frozen gravel. Breath clouds from horses and men dissolving into a sky that had cleared during the hearing, revealing stars that had been there all along, hidden behind cloud cover that had nothing to do with the stars and everything to do with the weather. They sat in the Ashcombe carriage. The door closed. The driver cracked the reins. The wheels began to turn. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Cadric said, "You should have told me about Mercer when you found the Redcliffe account." "Yes. You made a strategic calculation that my emotional response would compromise the operation." "Yes. You were correct." "I know. That does not make it acceptable." "No, it makes it effective. And in your world, effective has always been the only standard that mattered." "My world." He looked out the carriage window. The moors rolled past in the darkness, invisible except where moonlight caught the frost and turned the landscape into something that looked like hammered silver. "My world killed 9 men, and I filed them under equipment losses. Your world also employs 12,000 people and built the infrastructure that connects the north to the rest of England. The world is not one thing, Kydrick. It is everything. The question is which things you choose to see. I chose to see numbers. Numbers do not grieve. Numbers do not petition. Numbers do not stand in a parliamentary chamber and tell you that the system you built ground them into the machinery. And now you have chosen to see something else. I have chosen to build something else. Whether I can see it yet is a different question. The carriage moved through the frozen night. The wheels crunched on ice. The horses breathed in rhythmic clouds. Inside the enclosed space, in the darkness that smelled of leather and cold and the specific scent of two people who had just survived something that should have destroyed them, Seraphina felt the architecture of her marriage shift. Not into warmth. Kydrick Ashcombe would never be warm the way ordinary men were warm. His emotional register had been forged in conditions that did not produce tenderness, and asking him to generate it would be like asking the foundry to produce flowers. But something had changed in the space between them. The transactional distance that had defined their relationship from the Valecourt ballroom through the Ashcombe ledgers through the Wexmoor hearing had compressed into something denser and more volatile. Not trust exactly. Trust was too clean a word for what existed between two people who had both concealed and both confessed and both survived the consequences. What existed was more like mutual recognition, the understanding that each of them had seen the other completely, the machinery and the damage and the capability and the cost, and neither had looked away. The Safety Commission, Seraphina said, I will oversee the implementation. I assumed you would. And the compensation for the Harrogate families. Whatever you determine is appropriate. It will not be what you consider appropriate. It will be more. I expect nothing less. The carriage turned onto the northern road. The moors opened around them in every direction, vast and dark and indifferent to the empire that had been built upon them, and the empire that would continue to be built, differently now, by two people who had entered a ballroom as strangers and exited a parliamentary chamber as something the aristocracy would spend the next decade trying to name and failing. Spring arrived that year with a violence that matched the winter preceding it. The frost broke in March. The rivers swelled. The moors erupted in green so aggressive it looked like the landscape was trying to compensate for months of frozen austerity. Ashcombe Hall remained what it had always been, a fortress of black stone and industrial ambition, but the interior had changed in ways that visitors noticed immediately and struggled to articulate. The Safety Commission was operational within 6 weeks of the assembly. Seraphina staffed it with 3 independent engineers, 2 worker representatives elected by the foundry and mining crews, and a retired parliamentary inspector whose reputation for incorruptibility was matched only by his reputation for being impossible to work with. The Commission's first act was a comprehensive audit of all Ashcombe industrial operations. The audit identified 43 safety deficiencies across 4 foundries and 2 mining sites. Every deficiency was addressed within 90 days. Production decreased by 8% during the remediation period. Profits decreased correspondingly. Kydrick absorbed the losses without comment, which Seraphina understood was itself a form of commentary. Whitmore's coalition disintegrated within weeks of the assembly. The parliamentary committee ruled that the evidence presented against Ashcombe was fabricated and that the conspiracy to manufacture it constituted criminal fraud. Whitmore's banking alliances severed. His parliamentary allies distanced themselves with the practiced efficiency of men who had survived in politics by knowing exactly when to abandon a sinking position. By April, Whitmore's industrial holdings were hemorrhaging value. By June, his creditors had begun seizure proceedings. By autumn, the name Whitmore had been removed from the registries of 3 industrial associations and the membership rolls of 2 London clubs. Kydrick did not pursue him further. Seraphina asked him once why he showed restraint toward a man who had tried to destroy everything he built. Because destruction is not punishment, he said. They were in the estate office. Evening, the fire was burning. The foundry smoke drifted past the windows in the pattern she had memorized during her first week and now found as natural as weather. Destruction is release. Whitmore in ruins is Whitmore freed from the consequences of his failure. Whitmore alive, watching his empire dissolve while mine expands, carrying the knowledge that his own conspiracy provided the catalyst for reforms that made my operation stronger than his ever were. That is not mercy. That is architecture. You are describing a very specific kind of cruelty. I am describing efficiency. The cruelty is incidental. Nothing about you is incidental, Kaedric. He looked at her. The smoke-gray eyes, the angular face, the architecture of a man who had been rebuilt by the last 4 months into something that contained the same materials as before, but arranged them differently. Not softer. He would never be soft. But the rigidity had developed flexibility in specific places, the way steel developed flex when it was engineered for structures that needed to bend without breaking. The Safety Commission was one such flex. The compensation payments were another. The fact that he now ate breakfast with his wife every morning instead of alone in the West Wing was a third. Mercer wrote to me, he said. When? Last week. From Liverpool. He is establishing an independent workers' advocacy organization. He asked for funding. And I sent it, under Seraphina Ashcombe's name, because the irony amused me, and because the organization will be more effective with Ashcombe resources than without them. You funded your own betrayer's crusade against industrial abuse. I funded a competent man's effort to solve a problem I created. The fact that he betrayed me to get here is a cost I have already absorbed. Continuing to pay interest on that cost serves no structural purpose. The Valecourt family dissolved that same spring. Edmund died in February of complications that the physician attributed to liver failure, and that everyone else attributed to decades of drinking himself toward a death he had been courting since his fortune evaporated. Gerald and Marcus scattered to the continent, pursuing creditors and minor schemes in Paris and Vienna, and eventually disappearing into the specific anonymity that awaited aristocratic names detached from aristocratic resources. Seraphina received one letter from Gerald, 2 sentences, a request for money that did not include an apology, an explanation, or any acknowledgement that the sister he had helped humiliate in a ballroom was now the most powerful woman in English industry. She did not reply. She placed the letter in the bottom drawer of the estate office desk, beneath the ledgers that documented the empire she co-owned, and she did not open the drawer again. The Ashcombe legacy expanded through that year, and the years that followed with the relentless momentum of a system designed by 2 people who understood both the mechanics of power and the cost of wielding it without accountability. Railways extended south and west, boundaries modernized. The Safety Commission became a model that 3 competing industrial operations adopted voluntarily, partly from genuine reform and partly from the understanding that the Duchess of Ashcombe would make public examples of operations that did not meet the standards she had established. London society adapted. It always did. The same aristocrats who had watched Seraphina's humiliation at the Valecourt masquerade now sought invitations to Ashcombe Hall with the urgent persistence of people who understood that power had relocated and their survival depended on following it. Seraphina received them with the precise courtesy of a woman who remembered every face that had watched her brothers grab her arm and done nothing, and who had chosen not to punish them for it because punishment required caring about their opinion. And she had stopped caring about their opinion the night a man in black walked out of the shadows and changed the architecture of her life. On an evening in late October, 1 year after the masquerade that started everything, Seraphina found Kaedric standing in the corridor outside the estate office. He was looking at the wall, specifically at a space on the wall where nothing hung, a blank section of black stone between 2 gas lamps, unremarkable in every way. "What are you looking at?" she said. "This is where I stood the morning after you arrived," he said. "I stood here and listened to you moving inside the office, opening drawers, turning pages, beginning to dismantle the system I had spent 17 years building, and I did nothing to stop you. Why? Because I had spent 17 years building a system that no one challenged, and the absence of challenge had become the most dangerous structural flaw in the entire operation. You were the challenge I purchased because I was too disciplined to admit I needed one, and too intelligent to pretend I did not." He turned from the wall. He looked at her. And in his face she saw the complete record of what the last year had cost him and what it had built. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The set of his jaw carried a weight it had not carried before. But the eyes themselves had changed, not softer, wider, as though the aperture through which he viewed the world had been forced open by the cumulative impact of confession and reform and the daily, grinding discipline of becoming a man who could hold power without being consumed by it. "You are staring," he said. "I am auditing." And the assessment, structurally sound, requiring ongoing maintenance. Something happened to his face that she had seen only twice before. Once in the Valecourt ballroom when she demanded the ledgers. Once in the Wexmore chamber when she told him not to destroy Mercer. The expression that started as something severe and traveled, against every internal mechanism designed to prevent it, toward something that in another man would have been called a smile, but in Caedric Ashcombe was closer to the moment when a locked door opens and the person who locked it realizes they no longer remember why. "Ongoing maintenance," he repeated, indefinitely. "That sounds expensive. Everything worth maintaining is." He looked at her for a long time. The gas lamps hissed. The foundry hummed beneath the floor. Outside, October spread across the moors in the same bruised gold that had colored the world the night everything began, and inside Ashcombe Hall, in a corridor built from black stone and iron will, two people who had been forged by damage and refined by conflict stood in the space between who they had been and who they had become and recognized, without sentimentality and without illusion, that the distance between those 2 points was the most valuable thing either of them had ever built. He reached for her hand. His fingers closed around hers. The grip was not gentle. It was not rough. It was precise. The grip of a man who held things the way he built things, with the full commitment of someone who understood that anything worth holding was worth holding correctly. She did not pull away. The foundry fires burned on through the night. The railways stretched across England like steel veins carrying the lifeblood of an empire that had been broken and rebuilt and broken again and rebuilt again until the rebuilding itself became the empire's greatest product. And in the years that followed, when London drawing rooms whispered about the Black Duke and the woman he had purchased at a masquerade for a fortune that should have bought compliance but instead bought the only force on earth capable of making him change, the whispers always ended the same way. Not with fear, not with admiration, with the uneasy recognition that power shared between equals was not a concession or a weakness or a romantic gesture dressed in industrial language. It was the most dangerous architecture the aristocracy had ever encountered, because a single ruler could be destroyed, a single empire could be toppled, but two people who had survived each other, who had seen the worst of what the other was capable of, and chosen to build from the wreckage rather than walk away from it, could not be separated by any force the old world knew how to deploy. The Ashcombe name endured, not because it was feared, because it was earned, every day, by both of them. In a corridor made of black stone, in an empire made of iron, in a marriage made of everything the world insisted could not coexist and did.